Are you content? I read or listened to Paul's letter to the Philippians 30 times in 30 days. It's only 104 verses. You should try it sometime. And if you do, you'll find one sentence in it that really seems out of place. It just doesn't seem to fit. It doesn't sound like Paul. It's chapter 4, verse 11. Here it is. Not that I speak from want, for I have learned to be content in whatever circumstances I am. You see, the English definition of being content is being in an emotional state of peaceful happiness, and that includes the ideas of restfulness, cheerfulness, gladness, comfort, satisfaction, and even complacency. But Paul, writing from prison, wasn't saying that he had learned to be in some emotional state of peaceful happiness. And I'll tell you, I've heard too much be content instead of materialistic preaching based on that verse, and it's always misleading. Really is misleading because it's wrenched out of its context and based on the English definition of content instead of the Greek definition of the word actually used in that verse. Paul wrote Philippians from prison, and Roman prisons were dreadful places. They were dehumanizing, despicable, detestable, disgusting. Do you really think that Paul should have been satisfied with that? Satisfied and somehow smiling 24/7? I'll tell you, not a chance. And you see, Paul's life was marked by extremes. Listen to what he wrote in verse 12. I know how to get along with humble means, and I also know how to live in prosperity. In any and every circumstance, I have learned the secret of being filled and going hungry, both of having abundance and suffering need. And in 2 Corinthians 11, Paul described his life as being in many imprisonments, beaten many times, in danger of death, whipped 5 times by the Jews, beaten with rods, stoned 1 time, shipwrecked 3 times, and spending a night and a day in the deep, in the sea, without a boat. He wrote that he had been in dangers from rivers, dangers from robbers, dangers in the city, dangers in the wilderness, dangers on the sea, and dangers among false brethren. And he wrote that he had spent many, many sleepless nights, was in hunger and thirst, often without food, and in the cold and exposure. Think about it. Do you really believe that Paul was saying he had learned to be in some state of peaceful happiness in those circumstances? I'll tell you, he wasn't saying that. You see, the Greek word translated as content in Philippians 4:11 and in other New Testament verses has no one-word equivalent in English. Being content was a very important concept in Greek philosophy in Paul's day. It meant having an internal sufficiency and strength that was independent of external circumstances. It meant maintaining your life meaning and purpose, pressing on to the goal, independent of whatever life threw at you. So Paul was actually saying that he'd learned to have an internal sufficiency and strength that was independent of his circumstances. Reading on in Philippians 4, Paul said he had learned to have that internal sufficiency and strength in times of humble means, in times of prosperity, when full, when going hungry, when having abundance, when suffering need, and in a time of affliction. So, where did he get that internal sufficiency and strength? Listen to verse 13. Paul wrote, I can do all things in him, meaning in Christ. I can do all things in him who strengthens me. You might remember that verse as saying through Christ rather than in Christ. Well, it literally says in Christ. That's a better translation. Paul was saying that he was positionally in Christ. You see, being in Christ was the source of his strength. In verse 12, Paul said he'd learned the secret of being filled and going hungry, both of having abundance and suffering need. A literal translation of that is, I have been initiated into the mystery of being filled and going hungry, both of having abundance and suffering need. You see, in the extremes of Paul's life, he had been initiated into the mystery of an internal sufficiency and strength in Christ that was independent of his circumstances, independent of them if they were good or bad. It's obvious in times of severe struggle and suffering that we need that internal sufficiency and strength that comes from being in Christ. But Paul was also saying that he had been initiated into that mystery in times of prosperity and abundance. You see, in times of abundance, it's easy to rely on our physical resources, on our wealth, rather than relying on the sufficiency and strength that is in Christ. There's nothing wrong with God-given wealth and abundant resources. Thank Him for it. It's not materialistic. However, abundance tempts us to be in our abundance rather than in Christ. Did you get that? Prosperity tempts us to be in our abundance rather than in Christ. In Christ we are, in a sense, independent of good or bad circumstances. And then we have true peace, a peace that is also independent of our circumstances. That peace is not something that we create or contrive from our own sufficiency and strength. It is a peace that is the product of our being without reservation in Christ. Then, as Paul wrote in chapter 4, verse 7, and the peace of God, which surpasses all comprehension, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. Skeptic, seeker, if your internal sufficiency, strength, and peace are simply in you and in your circumstances rather than in Christ, then you are really missing out on something special. External circumstances, good or bad, can overpower you. True sufficiency, strength, and peace come not when you are simply in your circumstances, but when you are in Christ in your circumstances. If you see the need for that in your life, please check out 911god.org. That's 911god.org. And believer, please don't reduce Paul's Philippians 4 example to some call to be in an emotional state of peaceful happiness, comfort, satisfaction, or complacency. That's not what it says. Think of Philippians 4 as an example and an exhortation to fully depend on the internal sufficiency, strength, and peace that you already have from positionally being in Christ in any circumstance, good or bad, in times of need or times of abundance. As a believer, you are not just in your circumstances. You are in Christ in your circumstances. Because of that, you can do all things in Christ who strengthens you. Think about it. I'm John Morris, and this is Just a Question.